The room was cloaked in a thick, suffocating quiet, the kind that pressed against the soul and made every heartbeat thunder in one's ears. Elantra stood near the window of the small earth dwelling, her shimmering, iridescent skin reflecting faint streaks of moonlight that filtered through the blinds. The alien woman's sharp features softened under the glow, but her expression held a storm of emotions, uncertainty, longing, and an ache she could no longer ignore. Earth was vast and alive in ways her home world had never been. It buzzed with energy, filled with sounds and scents that overwhelmed her senses. Yet despite the planet's abundance, Elantra felt out of place. This was not her world, and she had come here for one reason. One person. Her gaze turned toward the door as she heard faint footsteps approaching. A human silhouette stepped inside, his shadow stretching into the dimly lit room. Allic. The name resonated in her mind, an anchor to memories both sweet and painful. He was taller than she remembered, broader, the weight of battle and loss evident in the lines etched across his face. He seemed older, wearier, but then again, so was she. "Elantra," he said, his voice steady but low. It wasn't a question, nor was it an accusation. It was simply her name, spoken with an air of disbelief, as though he had dreamed of her, but never thought she'd truly return. Her hands trembled at her sides, the overwhelming rush of seeing him again almost too much to bear. "It's me," she said softly, her voice catching on the words. She faltered, unable to find the strength to say what she had traveled so far to say. Instead, she looked at him, her glowing eyes pleading for him to understand without words. The air between them felt charged, but Allic's expression shifted from shock to guardedness. "Why are you here?" he asked. His tone wasn't cold, but it was distant. "After all this time, after everything that happened, why now?" Elantra's heart clenched. His words cut through her like a blade, and yet she knew he was right to question her. The war that had torn through her planet had also torn through their bond. It had been years since she had seen him, years since they had shared laughter, warmth, and hope. "I didn't know where else to go," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "My home is gone. My people, they're scattered, lost. And you." She paused, her chest tightening. "You're the only thing I have left, Allic." He took a step forward, the soft light illuminating his rugged face. She noticed the scar that ran along his temple, one that hadn't been there before. The sight of it made her stomach twist. How much had he suffered? How much of that suffering was because of her? "You shouldn't have come," Allic said, his tone conflicted. "We're not the same people we were back then, Elantra. Too much has happened." A spark of frustration flared within her. "I know that," she snapped, though her voice cracked under the weight of her emotions. "Do you think this is easy for me? Coming here, facing you after all that's happened. I'm not the same either, Allic, but that doesn't mean I don't need you." He flinched, as though her words had struck a nerve. The silence that followed was unbearable. Elantra's mind raced, filled with memories of their time together. She remembered the way he used to smile, the way his touch had once made her feel alive in ways her cold, distant people never could. That bond had been everything to her. And now, standing before him, she realized just how fragile it had become. "I don't know if I can do this," Allic said finally, his voice laced with doubt. He turned his gaze to the floor, unable to meet her eyes. "I don't know if I can be what you need." Elantra stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "I don't need you to fix me," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I just need you to remember, to feel." His head lifted slightly, his eyes searching hers for something. Certainty, perhaps, or absolution. She wasn't sure what he found, but he didn't pull away when she reached for him. Her fingers, soft and trembling, grazed the side of his face. The warmth of his skin sent a wave of familiarity through her, a reminder of everything they had once been. "Do it again, human," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Love me again." Her words hung in the air like a fragile thread, waiting to either break or hold strong. Allic's breath hitched, his hands twitching at his sides, as though he wanted to reach out to her but was afraid of what might happen if he did. The vulnerability in his gaze mirrored her own, and for the first time in years, Elantra felt a flicker of hope. "I don't know if I can," he said, his voice trembling with uncertainty. "But I want to try." The words were enough. They didn't fix everything. They didn't erase the pain or the distance between them. But they were a beginning. And for Elantra, that was all she needed. The silence between them grew heavier, broken only by the faint hum of the Earth's night. Outside the window, stars dotted the sky, a reminder of the vast expanse that had once separated them. Now, only a few feet stood between Allic and Elantra, but the weight of their shared past made that space feel insurmountable. Allic's heart was racing. Seeing her again was like a wound reopening, one he wasn't sure he could bear to touch. The memories came flooding back, their laughter in the quiet moments, the whispered promises under alien skies, and the inevitable shattering of it all. He had spent years convincing himself she was gone, that he had to move on. Yet here she was, standing in his living room, looking at him with those luminous eyes that once held his entire world. "I thought I'd never see you again," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. He ran a hand through his dark hair, his fingers pausing as though caught in the strands of his own hesitation. "I told myself I was fine with that it was better that way." Elantra took a small step closer, her movements careful, deliberate. She could feel his unease, the tension radiating from him like a shield he had built around himself. "I told myself the same thing," she replied softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it wasn't true. Allic, it was never true." Her words struck a chord deep within him. He had spent so long building walls to keep the pain out, but seeing her again was like watching those walls crumble, piece by agonizing piece. His eyes flicked to hers, searching for something, anything, to anchor himself. But her gaze was steady, unwavering, and it unsettled him. "Elantra." He trailed off, unsure of how to continue. "I don't know if I can be what you need. I don't even know if I'm the same man you remember." Her chest tightened at his words, the ache inside her growing with every passing second. "I don't need you to be the same," she said, stepping closer until there was barely any space between them. "I'm not the same either. None of us are. But that doesn't mean we can't try to find each other again." The vulnerability in her voice made his breath catch. He wanted to pull away, to protect himself from the storm he could feel brewing between them. But he couldn't. Not when her words resonated with a truth he couldn't ignore. "You don't understand," he said, his voice breaking. "I failed you, Elantra. I couldn't save you, couldn't save your people. And now—" He stopped, his fists clenching at his sides. "Now, I don't know if I can even save myself." Her heart ached at the pain in his voice. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed against his hand. The contact was electric, a spark of something that had once been so familiar, yet now felt fragile, tentative. "You didn't fail me," she said, her tone firm despite the tears threatening to spill from her eyes. "You gave me something no one else ever did. You made me feel seen, Allic. You showed me what it meant to be alive, to feel, to love. And I've carried that with me every day since." He looked at her then, really looked at her. The glow of her skin seemed softer in the dim light, her eyes reflecting a depth of emotion he hadn't seen before. For the first time, he noticed the faint scars on her arms, the weariness etched into her features. She had suffered too, maybe even more than he had. "I don't know how to fix this," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "I don't know where to start." Elantra stepped closer, her hand sliding up to rest on his cheek. The warmth of his skin against her palm sent a shiver down her spine, a reminder of everything they had once shared. "We don't need to fix anything," she whispered. "We just need to try, together." The room seemed to shrink around them, the world outside fading into insignificance. For a moment, There was nothing but the two of them, standing on the precipice of something neither could fully understand. The space between them was no longer a chasm, but a bridge waiting to be crossed. Allic closed his eyes, his breath hitching as he leaned into her touch. "I'm scared," he admitted, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "Of losing you again. Of failing you again." "You won't lose me," she said, her voice steady. "Not this time." Her words wrapped around him like a balm, soothing the raw edges of his fear. Slowly, hesitantly, he reached up and placed his hand over hers, anchoring her touch against his skin. The warmth of her fingers seeped into him, melting away some of the cold that had settled in his chest. "I don't know what this means," he said, his voice trembling, "but I want to try." Elantra smiled, a small, tentative thing, but it was enough. "Then that's all we need." The weight between them began to lift, replaced by a fragile hope that neither dared to name. They were two broken souls, scared by war and loss, but in that moment they found something neither had thought possible: a chance to heal, together, a fragile reunion. The morning light streamed through the window, casting a soft glow over the room. Elantra stood by the edge of the couch, gazing at Allic as he busied himself in the kitchen. His movements were deliberate, almost mechanical, as though he were unsure how to behave now that she was here. For the first time in years, they were in the same space, but the silence between them was heavy. It wasn't the oppressive silence of hurt and uncertainty from the night before, but something different, a fragile truce, a tentative peace. They were feeling their way through the ruins of what they once had, unsure of how to rebuild. Allic placed 2 cups on the counter, steam rising from their contents. "It's not much," he said, his voice low, almost shy. "Just tea. I didn't know if you still drink it." Elantra gave him a small, appreciative smile. "I remember," she replied, stepping forward to take the cup. She wrapped her fingers around the warm ceramic, the heat seeping into her palms. "You made it for me when we were stranded in that cave after the ambush. You said it was to keep me warm." His lips curved into a faint smile. "And you hated it. It tasted like boiled dirt," she said, her own smile growing wider. "But I drank it anyway." The shared memory seemed to ease the tension, if only for a moment. They both sipped their tea in silence, stealing glances at each other like strangers reacquainting themselves. The air between them still felt delicate, as though a single wrong word could shatter the fragile connection they had begun to rebuild. "You're different," Allic said after a while, his voice breaking the quiet. He wasn't accusing her, just observing. "Your glow, it's dimmer than I remember." Elantra lowered her gaze, her fingers tightening around the cup. "My people's bioluminescence is tied to our emotions, our inner state," she explained. "After everything, it's harder to keep it bright." His heart clenched at her words. He had seen her glow at its brightest, when she was filled with wonder at Earth's sunsets, when she had laughed at his clumsy attempts to learn her language, when they had danced under the stars on a forgotten planet. Seeing her now, dim and subdued, was like looking at a fading ember of the woman he had known. "I'm sorry," he said softly, setting his cup down, "for everything you've lost, for what happened to your people." Elantra met his gaze, her glowing eyes holding a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. "You didn't cause it, Allic," she said gently. "You were the only one who tried to help, the only one who ever cared." He looked away, his jaw tightening. "I didn't do enough. I couldn't stop the war, couldn't stop what they did to you." "You saved me," she countered, stepping closer, "when no one else would. You gave me hope when I thought I had none. That's more than anyone has ever done for me." Her words cut through his guilt like a blade. He had spent years carrying the weight of his perceived failures, but hearing her say those words, seeing the earnestness in her eyes, felt like a small salve to his wounds. Allic sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Why did you come back, Elantra?" he asked, his voice tinged with vulnerability. "What are you looking for?" She hesitated, the answer catching in her throat. She had asked herself the same question countless times during her journey to Earth. Was it closure? A chance to reclaim what they had lost? Or was it something simpler, something deeper? "I'm looking for you," she said finally, her voice trembling with emotion. "Because without you, I don't know who I am anymore." Her admission hung in the air, raw and unguarded. Allic's breath caught as he stared at her, the walls he had built around his heart beginning to crumble. He wanted to say something, to offer her reassurance, but the words eluded him. Elantra took another step closer, closing the distance between them. She reached out, her hand brushing against his arm. "We've both been broken, Allic, by the war, by what we've lost. But maybe we can help each other heal." His eyes searched hers, looking for any sign of doubt, but all he saw was sincerity. Slowly he nodded, the weight of his fears and regrets easing just enough to let her words sink in. "I don't know if I can give you what you need," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I'll try, if you'll let me." Elantra smiled, a small tentative thing, but it held a spark of hope. "That's all I've ever wanted." For the first time in years, Allic felt a flicker of something he thought he had lost forever. Connection. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was there, a fragile thread binding them together. As they stood there, the morning light washing over them, it felt like the beginning of something new. Not a return to the past, but a step forward into the unknown, together. The first step. The days that followed were filled with a quiet rhythm, like a song slowly piecing itself back together. Allic and Elantra began to navigate the delicate terrain of their renewed connection, both hesitant and eager to find footing in the fragile space they now shared. Elantra spent most of her time exploring Allic's small home, an earth dwelling that felt both foreign and comforting. She marveled at the simplicity of it. Wooden floors that creaked with age, shelves lined with books, and windows that let in golden sunlight. It was so different from the sterile, utilitarian structures of her homeworld. Here, everything felt alive, as though the house itself held memories within its walls. Allic watched her from a distance, his heart tugging at the sight of her inspecting small trinkets and running her fingers over the spines of books. She seemed lost in thought, her luminous skin glowing faintly in the warm light. For a moment, it reminded him of the woman she had been before the war, curious, vibrant, and unyieldingly hopeful. "Do you always keep everything so cluttered?" Elantra asked one afternoon, holding up a small sculpture of a bird. Her voice carried a teasing lilt, a hint of the playful tone she once had. Allic chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's not clutter, it's character," he replied. "Everything here tells a story." She turned the bird over in her hands, her expression softening. "I like that. Stories. My people. We were never good at keeping them. We let history fade too easily." "Well," he said, walking closer, "maybe it's time you start writing your own." The comment caught her off guard, and for a moment, she said nothing. The idea of crafting her own story felt foreign to her. For so long, she had been swept up in the tides of war and loss, a passenger in her own life. But now, with Allic beside her, the possibility of something more felt within reach. "Maybe," she said softly, setting the sculpture back on the shelf. That evening, they sat on the back porch of Allic's home, watching the stars emerge one by one. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the faint scent of earth and pine. Elantra tilted her head back, her glowing eyes reflecting the constellations above. "Your sky is so full," she murmured, her voice filled with wonder. Allic leaned back in his chair, following her gaze. "What was your sky like?" She paused, a flicker of sadness crossing her features. "Empty," she said finally. "Our planet was surrounded by dense clouds. We rarely saw the stars. It's why I love this place so much. Here, the universe feels close." He studied her profile, the way her expression softened as she spoke. "You've always had a way of seeing beauty where others wouldn't." She turned to him, her gaze locking onto his. and you've always had a way of showing it to me." The moment stretched between them, the silence carrying a weight that felt both comforting and charged. Allic's chest tightened as he held her gaze, memories of their past rushing to the surface. He wanted to reach out, to close the small distance between them, but the fear of moving too quickly held him back. "Allic," she said, her voice breaking the quiet. "I'm scared." The admission startled him. "Of what?" he asked gently. "Of losing this," she said, motioning between them. "Of losing you again." Her vulnerability struck a chord deep within him. He had spent so long running from his own fears, burying them beneath layers of guilt and self-preservation. But hearing her say those words made him realize that he wasn't alone in his uncertainty. "You're not going to lose me," he said firmly, leaning closer. "Not this time." She looked at him, her luminous eyes searching his face for any hint of doubt. Slowly, she nodded, her expression softening. "Then promise me," she whispered. "Promise me we'll try. No matter how hard it gets." He reached out, his hand brushing against hers. "I promise." As the night deepened, they found themselves talking about everything and nothing. The war, their past, the small, inconsequential details of everyday life. It was as though they were rediscovering each other, piece by piece, filling in the gaps left by years of separation. For the first time in a long while, Allic felt a sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was real. And as he watched Elantra lean back in her chair, her face tilted toward the stars, he realized that maybe, just maybe, they had a chance at something new. The journey ahead wouldn't be simple. They both carried scars, both had wounds that would take time to heal. But for the first time in years, they were taking that first step together. When worlds collide, the days of tentative peace gave way to something deeper. Allic and Elantra began to share more of themselves, unraveling the tangled threads of their pasts and exploring the fragile possibility of a future. But as their bond grew, so too did the challenges of bridging the divide between two worlds that were never meant to coexist. One afternoon, as Elantra stood in the garden behind Allic's house, she found herself captivated by the vibrant colors of Earth's flora. Her glowing fingertips brushed against the petals of a bright red flower, its soft texture a sharp contrast to the metallic, crystalline plants of her homeworld. "These flowers," she said when Allic joined her, his hands carrying a pair of mugs, "they're so alive. Ours were always cold, brittle. They never felt real." He handed her a mug, watching her as she marveled at the flower. "That's Earth for you," he said with a faint smile. "Full of life, even in the smallest things." Elantra took the mug, the warmth seeping into her hands. "Your planet feels so open," she murmured, "but it also feels fragile." Allic's gaze shifted to the horizon, his expression growing thoughtful. "It is fragile," he admitted, "but that's why we fight so hard to protect it." Her eyes lingered on him, the weight of his words sinking in. "That's what makes you different," she said softly. "Your people. You hold on to what matters, even when it hurts." He turned to her, his brow furrowing slightly. "What about your people? What do they hold on to?" She hesitated, her expression darkening. "Nothing," she said finally. "Not anymore. The war took everything from us. Our homes, our families, even our hope. All we have left is survival. But even that feels hollow." Allic's heart ached at the pain in her voice. He wanted to reach out, to comfort her, but he wasn't sure how. Instead, he said the only thing that came to mind. "You don't have to survive alone anymore." Her glowing eyes met his, and for a moment, the world seemed to still. "Neither do you," she replied. Their bond continued to deepen, but the cracks between their worlds began to show. Allic saw it in the way Elantra struggled to adapt to the small, unspoken customs of Earth, her confusion at the concept of personal space, her hesitation when faced with Earth's chaotic, bustling cities. And Elantra saw it in Allic's reluctance to fully let her in, as though he feared she might slip through his fingers if he held on too tightly. One evening, as they walked through a crowded market, the tension between them came to a head. The sounds of laughter and chatter filled the air, blending with the vibrant sights and smells of street vendors. But while Allic navigated the chaos with ease, Elantra seemed overwhelmed, her glowing skin dimming as her anxiety grew. "Are you okay?" Allic asked, noticing her discomfort. "I'm fine," she replied quickly, though her posture betrayed her unease. "It's just loud." He frowned, stepping closer to shield her from the crowd. "We can leave if it's too much." She shook her head, her pride refusing to let her retreat. "No. I need to learn. I can't keep running from this." Allic admired her determination, but he could see the strain it was putting on her. "Elantra, you don't have to prove anything to me," he said gently. "It's okay to take things slow." Her glowing eyes flicked to his, frustration flickering within them. "I'm not trying to prove anything," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. I don't want to be a burden." The word struck him like a blow. "A burden," he repeated, his tone laced with disbelief. "Elantra, you're not." But she cut him off, her voice trembling. "I am, Allic. I felt it since the moment I came here. I'm an alien on a foreign world, clinging to a man who probably wishes I'd stayed gone." The raw vulnerability in her words silenced him. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond. Then, without thinking, he reached out and took her hand, his grip firm and steady. "I don't wish that," he said firmly. "Not for a second." She looked at him, her glowing eyes wide with surprise. "Then why do you keep holding back?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why does it feel like you're afraid of me?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Because I am afraid," he admitted. "Not of you, but of losing you again, of screwing this up." Her expression softened, the frustration giving way to understanding. "We're both afraid," she said quietly. "But if we let that fear control us, we'll never find what we're looking for." Allic nodded, her words sinking in. Slowly, he squeezed her hand, the warmth of her touch grounding him. "Then let's stop running," he said. "Let's face it, together." Her lips curved into a small, hopeful smile. "Together," she echoed. As they walked hand in hand through the market, the noise and chaos seemed to fade into the background. They still had a long way to go, but for the first time, it felt like they were moving forward, no longer two broken souls drifting in the void, but a single thread weaving their worlds together. The healing wound. The days stretched into weeks, and though progress was slow, Allic and Elantra began to find a rhythm in their shared life. It wasn't perfect. They stumbled, sometimes fell, but they always found a way to get back up together. Each small step forward felt like a triumph, a piece of the fractured bond they were rebuilding. One evening, the two sat by the fireplace in Allic's small home. The soft crackle of burning wood filled the silence, the warm glow of the flames dancing across the walls. Allic leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on Elantra, as she held one of his old books in her hands. She had taken to reading Earth literature with a fascination that bordered on obsessive curiosity, her glowing fingers delicately turning the pages. "You humans have a strange way of telling stories," she said, her voice thoughtful as her eyes scanned the text. "There's always so much emotion, so much vulnerability." Allic smirked. "You say that like it's a bad thing." "It's not," she admitted, setting the book down. "It's just different. My people, we didn't tell stories like this. Everything was practical, functional. We didn't dwell on feelings or connections. Maybe that's why we lost so much." Her voice grew softer, tinged with sadness. Allic leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You didn't lose everything," he said. "You're still here." She looked at him, her glowing eyes reflecting the flickering firelight. "Sometimes I wonder if that's enough," she confessed. "If surviving is enough." "It is," he replied firmly. "Because surviving means you have a chance to rebuild, to find something new." Her gaze lingered on him, and for a moment, the silence between them was filled with unspoken words. Then, with a deep breath, she leaned forward. "Do you really believe that? Even after everything we've lost?" He nodded, his expression unwavering. "I do. Because if I didn't, I wouldn't have made it this far." The next morning, Elantra stood in the garden, her glowing skin catching the first rays of sunlight. Allic watched her from the kitchen window as she moved among the flowers, her delicate touch brushing against the petals. She seemed lighter somehow, more at ease. He couldn't help but smile at the sight. But as he stepped outside to join her, he noticed the faint scar on her arm, a jagged line that stood out against her shimmering skin. He hadn't seen it before, and the sight of it stirred a mix of emotions within him. "What happened there?" he asked gently, motioning toward her arm. Elantra glanced down, her expression darkening. "It's nothing," she said quickly, turning away. "It doesn't look like nothing," he pressed, his voice soft but insistent. "You don't have to hide it from me." She hesitated, her glowing skin dimming slightly. Finally, she sighed and turned back to face him. "It happened during the war," she admitted. "A human weapon. It struck me when I was trying to protect a group of my people. It's one of the reasons I left." Allic's heart clenched at her words. "You were hurt by us." She nodded, her gaze distant. "It wasn't your fault. The humans who attacked didn't know I was trying to help. To them, I was just another enemy." Her voice was steady, but Allic could hear the pain beneath it. He reached out, his hand brushing against hers. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "For what happened to you. For what my people did." Elantra looked at him, her eyes softening. "You have nothing to apologize for, Allic," she said gently. "You saved me. You showed me that not all humans are the same. That there's more to your kind than war and destruction." He shook his head, his jaw tightening. "It doesn't make it right." "No, it doesn't," she agreed. "But what matters is what we do now, how we move forward." Her words hung in the air, a quiet reminder of the resilience they both carried. Slowly, Allic nodded, the weight of his guilt easing just enough for him to breathe. That night, as they sat together by the fire once more, Elantra turned to him with a question that had been lingering in her mind. "Why did you save me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "When everyone else saw me as an enemy, why did you choose to help me?" Allic looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "Because I saw something in you," he said finally. "Something I couldn't ignore. You weren't just another alien. You were you." Her heart ached at his words, the sincerity in his voice washing over her like a balm. "And you were the first human who made me feel like more than just an alien," she admitted. "You made me feel alive." They sat in silence after that, the firelight casting their shadows on the walls. The wounds they carried were still there, but in that moment, they felt just a little bit lighter. Together, they were beginning to heal, not just their scars, but the space between their worlds. A new beginning. The early morning sun bathed the world in a soft golden glow, the kind that made everything feel fresh and full of promise. Allic and Elantra stood side by side in the small garden behind his home, the cool grass brushing against their feet. The air carried a quiet stillness, a serenity that seemed to mirror the fragile peace they had found together. For the first time in a long while, Elantra felt hope stirring within her. The weight of her past still lingered, but it no longer crushed her. It was a part of her, a reminder of where she had been, but not a chain holding her back. She glanced at Allic, who was staring at the horizon, his expression calm but determined. "What's on your mind?" she asked softly, her voice breaking the silence. He turned to her, his eyes meeting hers. "You," he said simply. "Us." Her heart fluttered at the warmth in his voice. "What about us?" He hesitated, as though searching for the right words. "I'd spent so long running from the past," he admitted, "from what happened, from what I lost. But being with you again, it's made me realize that maybe it's time to stop running. Maybe it's time to build something new. Elantra's glowing eyes softened, a small smile tugging at her lips. And you think we can do that? Build something new? He nodded, his gaze steady. We've already started. It won't be easy, and it won't be perfect, but I think it's worth trying. Don't you? She took a deep breath, letting his words settle over her. For so long, she had been adrift, searching for something she couldn't name. But now, standing here with him, she realized that she had already found it. It wasn't a place or a thing. It was him. It was them. Yes, she said finally, her voice firm. It's worth trying. Later that day, they ventured into the nearby forest, the canopy of trees casting dappled shadows on the ground. Allic carried a small pack on his back, filled with supplies for their outing. Elantra followed closely behind, her curiosity piqued by the unfamiliar sounds and scents of the forest. "What is this place?" she asked, her voice filled with wonder. "It's an old hiking trail," Allic explained. "People used to come here all the time to escape the city, to connect with nature. I thought you might like it." She smiled, her glowing skin brightening slightly. "It's beautiful, peaceful." As they walked, Allic pointed out various plants and animals, sharing little stories and facts about each one. Elantra listened intently, her fascination with Earth's ecosystem growing with every step. It was a world so different from her own, yet it felt strangely welcoming. Eventually, they reached a small clearing where a stream trickled through the rocks, its clear water sparkling in the sunlight. Allic set down his pack and pulled out a blanket, spreading it on the ground. They sat together by the stream, the gentle sound of water filling the air. "Do you ever miss it?" Allic asked after a while, his voice thoughtful. "Miss what?" Elantra replied. "Your home. Your world." She stared at the stream for a moment, her expression contemplative. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but not in the way I thought I would. I miss the people I lost, the things I never got to say. But my world, it never felt like home. Not the way this place does." Allic's chest tightened at her words. He reached out, his hand brushing against hers. "Then maybe this can be your home, if you want it to be." She turned to him, her glowing eyes meeting his. "Home isn't a place, Allic. It's a feeling. And I think I've already found it." Her words filled him with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. Slowly, he laced his fingers through hers, the connection between them grounding him in a way he hadn't thought possible. For the first time, the future didn't feel so uncertain. It felt like a promise. As the sun began to set, casting the forest in hues of orange and gold, Allic and Elantra made their way back home. The path ahead was still unknown, but they no longer feared it. Together, they had faced the shadows of their past and emerged stronger, more whole. Standing in the doorway of his house, Allic turned to her, his voice steady. "Whatever happens next, we'll face it together." Elantra smiled, her glow brightening as she reached out to touch his face. "Together," she echoed. And with that, they stepped inside, ready to begin their new story. A story of healing, of hope, and of a love that transcended worlds.